All right. In our next two videos, we'll be exploring a period of American history that's very complicated and really not very many people know much about the period called Reconstruction, which is the 10 or 12 years right after the Civil War. And as I've said, obviously it's important that we study the Civil War to understand America in the present day. Nothing in history is just in the past. It's all connected to the present. But I think if you really want to get a handle on how the Civil War era and the changes that brought to the country affect us today, you really have to explore Reconstruction too. You can't just say, well, the war ended, we're done. Looking at the 10 or 12 years after the Civil War gives us a great window into how the country tried and in most ways failed to move on from the Civil War, how it set the tone for a lot of issues that we're still dealing with in present-day America. And I think it's so crucial, it's worth two videos to discuss with you guys. So in the first instance, there's an image I like to use that I think sums up some of the tensions you're going to see in Reconstruction, and it's right here on your screen. You've got an angry white mob on the left-hand side, a bunch of angry African Americans on the right-hand side, and in the middle is a Union soldier trying to break up the fight. And you'll notice it looks like he's defending the black people and not the white people. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of anger in the country after the war. The South is upset that they lost. There's changes coming in terms of rights for African Americans now that slavery's been abolished. The whole nation was changing in big ways. And you've got the fact that you literally have to reconstruct the country. That's one of the reasons they call it Reconstruction. And anytime you rebuild something, it's never exactly the same as it was before. The nation that came out of the Civil War is very different than the United States was before the Civil War. And you'll see that as we go through this conversation. And one great way to look at this and how people in all parts of the country were struggling with new relationships and new realities after the war comes from a little story I want to tell you. And it's a sample of some challenging situations that a lot of people found themselves in. Okay, so here's your story. And I want you to just think about how this might play out, okay? It's a story of a Confederate veteran. He had fought in the Confederate Army in the Civil War. His name was Thomas Pinckney. And Tom Pinckney was leaving the Confederate Army after the war was over. He was on his way home. And he was a plantation owner in the South before the war. He still owned this plantation even while he was off fighting for the Confederacy. So now he's on his way home. And the night before he got back to his plantation, Pinckney stopped at the house of a friend of his. He was on the road back to his own plantation. He hadn't seen this friend in a while. They had to catch up. They had to swap war stories because they had been stationed with different armies in the war. And Pinckney was talking to this friend of his, and the friend says, I got to warn you, Tom, when you get home, you're not going to like what you see. I heard through the grapevine that your Negroes have sacked your house. Now, you notice the possessive term your, even though the war's over. And Pinckney had to acknowledge, slavery was abolished, whether he liked it or not. But they're still talking about these people as in a possessive sense. Your Negroes is the way it was phrased to Pinckney. So Pinckney hears that his former slaves, and he's still having a hard time thinking of them as anything but his own slaves, have taken over his property. And he got home the next day, and that's exactly what he found. He found his former slaves on his porch, in his house, in his kitchen, and they heard Pinckney coming, and they took off out of the house, but he gathered all of them together, all these black men, women, and children that were his property up until just a couple of months earlier. And he sent them on his yard, and he gave them a speech. And he says, I know you're free. I don't like it, but I know you're free. I'm not trying to interfere with that. It's the law. Slavery's dead. But I still need people to work on my property. I need people to work my land. I have to get a crop in. I have to get ready for the harvest. I want you to work for me. He says this to all of his former slaves. I will pay you wages, he says. Now, what do you think? And these former slaves, these freed people, or freedmen, as they're going to be called, said, oh yeah, we're going to work this land, but we're not going to work for you. You're not our master anymore. This land belongs to us. We've been working it our whole lives, and we're going to stay here and work the land for ourselves. Your time is up. You're not our master anymore. And Pinckney says, well, that's just not going to do. He still sees himself as the master. He still owns this property. And so he says, you know what? I won't pay anybody a dime unless all of you come to work for me. And for a long time, for like a month, you have these former slaves in the old slave cabins running low on food. You've got Thomas Pinckney sitting in his mansion wishing that he had workers, and neither one of them was willing to accept the same relationship that they had. Eventually, a couple of these former slaves came up to Pinckney and said, look, we're hungry and we're willing to work for you. And Pinckney says, nope, it's all or nothing. And I want you to just think to yourself. Obviously, I can give you the answer in a second. There's two ways this could go. After about a month, the standoff ended. And one option is the former slaves won the standoff, and Pinckney was forced to leave his property, and these former slaves took over this land. The other option might be Pinckney won the standoff, and all these former slaves came trickling back to him and ended up working for their old master for a wage. And as you're watching this, I want you to think to yourself which one you think is the result. Because I'll tell you, within a month, every one of these former slaves came crawling back to Thomas Pinckney, and he won this standoff. Pinckney had virtually his entire collection of former slaves working for him. For wages, sure. But aside from him paying them, it's not much of a different arrangement. It's the same people working the same land for the same boss. And all over the South, there's this whole reevaluation of what this relationship is going to mean. And the sad truth is, a lot of these former slaves will find themselves in the same position as Pinckney's former slaves, with few other options, especially in the South, that's going to resist this idea of freedom for the slaves. It's going to be an uphill battle, definitely. And Pinckney said he suffered in all of this. So whether you believe him or not, but he was trying to struggle with this new reality too. He was used to a social order that had him on top without question, and now he has to accept that he has to pay these people. It was hard for him to swallow too. I'm not asking you to sympathize, but that's the way it was. So as we enter Reconstruction as a country, there's a lot going on. When you hit 1865, or for the next 10 or 12 years after the Civil War, there's a lot of things to deal with. I mean, let's just start with the fact that you had 11 states that had seceded from the Union and claimed to be part of a separate country for the whole 4 years of the Civil War. Remember, Abraham Lincoln, before he died, said, let them up easy. His idea was, we'll just let them come back into the Union and we'll deal with our differences gradually. You have other people in the North who don't want to be that nice, who call what the South did treason and traitorous behavior. And their argument is the South has to be punished. It's a long uphill battle to literally reconstruct this country and bring these states back in. There's a big fact that all we've said to the freedmen, to the former slaves by 1865 was, you're no longer slaves. We had an amendment to the Constitution, the 13th, that said slavery is dead, but it didn't say anything about what that meant, about what freedom really meant. These former slaves, these free people, are expecting rights and equality, and I don't think you're going to see a lot of white people who are willing to just hand it to them yet. That's one of the biggest struggles we went through as a country in Reconstruction, and I would say since then as well. And then you've got a couple political issues that are swirling around that are really going to drive Reconstruction too. And in a lot of ways, we're still, again, wrestling with these today. During the Civil War, you might remember, Abraham Lincoln had done some things that made some people say he was overstepping his authority as president, like suspending habeas corpus. Congress thought he maybe was acting too unilaterally on his own without conferring with them. Congress is going to try to get some control back in Reconstruction. It's going to be a mess. And then you've got the fact that the South, at least in part, had seceded because of a belief in states' rights over a strong central government. And yes, slavery was a factor. Oh, heck yeah, you can't take slavery out of it. But the question of whether the central government or the states should be more powerful, something we wrestled with in Reconstruction, and again, something we're still debating as Americans in the present day. So these are all things we have to work with. And actually, if you want to sign about how the argument of Reconstruction was going to go, you actually have to take a step back. We're gonna bring Abe back from the dead for just a second. If you're a Lincoln fan, here's your last chance to see him, because you know last time we killed him at the theater, right? Okay, well, we didn't do it. Booth did. You know what I mean. Before Lincoln died, before the war had even ended, when it was pretty clear that the North was going to win the war, Lincoln had proposed what he called his 10% plan for Reconstruction, for readmitting the southern states and bringing the Union back together. And I lay it out for you, and I want you to think to yourself about how much this is really punishing the South. There's two pieces to it. He says, if a Confederate state wants to come back into the Union, they need to find 10% of that state's voting population to swear a loyalty oath to the United States government. Now, voting population then, of course, meant white men. And I'll tell you, it wasn't that hard to find 10% of the white men in a Confederate state to swear loyalty to the United States government. Remember, not everyone in any of those states had supported secession. So yeah, Lincoln didn't think it would be that hard to find 10% of the white men in a southern state to swear loyalty. And then he says that southern state has to agree to change their state's constitution so that they abolish slavery in their state. That's what he said. And I'll tell you, this didn't go far enough for some people. A lot of people were wrestling with the same question I just raised. You said slavery is over, but what does that mean? What kind of rights are we going to give these African Americans? Lincoln didn't say anything about rights for black people in his 10% plan. If you know what the word suffrage means, it means the right to vote. He didn't say anything in this plan about giving black men the right to vote. I think his attitude was, we'll deal with that gradually. Honestly, I think Lincoln's 10% plan was deliberately easy on the South. I think he wanted to let the South come back into the country rather easily, rather painlessly, so that we could work our differences out gradually. Catch is, as you know, Lincoln is not going to be around during Reconstruction. The people who are really going to be calling the shots for most of Reconstruction were people in Lincoln's own political party. And they generally get this label, radical Republicans, radical being really hardcore and aggressive and trying to be very extreme in their actions and their views. Just to give you an example of some of these people, people in Lincoln's own Republican Party who thought while he was alive that he was being too soft on the South and his plans for after the war, and who believed that the South was guilty of treason and that they should be punished. People like these two guys, I'll introduce them to you. We've actually seen Charles Sumner before. Remember the guy before the war who got beaten down with the cane by Preston Brooks? So Sumner is the guy in the sepia tone of the brown picture in the lower right-hand corner. He's back in Congress. In the upper left, you got Thaddeus Stevens. He was a congressman from Pennsylvania who was a big abolitionist, a hater of slavery, a believer in racial equality. Not a lot of people knew this at the time. He actually had a black wife. They adopted some black orphan children. This is a guy who believes in racial equality, and that led him to believe that the South needed to be punished for slavery and for secession and for the war. And before Lincoln even died, people like Stevens and Sumner took a look at Lincoln's 10% plan, said this is way too lenient, way too easy on the South. They have to be punished. And so this is their counter proposal. I just want to walk you through this so you can get a sense of what's going to come in Reconstruction. The name of the bill is boring. It's two guys named Wade and Davis who came up with it. I'm sorry that I even have to mention that. But the content of it is really key. These guys said 10% of the white men in the South, in the southern states swearing loyalty, that's too easy. No, a majority, over half, over 50% of the white men in the southern state have to swear loyalty to the United States government before we will let that state come back into the Union. And agreeing to abolish slavery is not going to nearly be enough. You have to accept black suffrage, the right to vote for black men if your southern state wants to come back into this union. That's how hardcore these guys were going to be. They knew it wasn't going to be easy for the southern states to achieve this. And so this all happened before Lincoln went to that play and he got shot. And I just want to mention this because it plays a role in Reconstruction. I'm assuming you know, like your basic government function, if a bill comes out of Congress and a president doesn't like that bill, it can be vetoed, right? But also if a president vetoes a bill, that veto can be overridden by Congress. If Congress gets enough of a vote, they can override a president's veto. I hope you already knew that. I hope that's not new information. So Lincoln took a look at this Wade Davis bill before he got shot. He says, well, I don't support that, but I'm not going to veto it either. Because if I veto it, Congress will just come back and override my veto, and then we're going to have some trouble. So what Lincoln actually did before he died, it's called pocket vetoing a bill. He just ignored it. It's like almost like he put it in his back pocket until it expired. That way it didn't pass, he didn't sign it, he didn't veto it, he just pretended it didn't exist. Because the bottom line is Lincoln's attitude was very different from these radical Republicans. And I'll leave it up to you watching this to decide who you support more. We can discuss it. I think it's worth more discussion. Lincoln said, you don't kick a defeated enemy while they're down. The South was lost. Rubbing that defeat in their face will just make them cry for more vengeance and more revenge later on, as we've said before. The radical Republicans didn't care. They said the South committed treason. They took up arms against the U.S. government. They supported this inhuman system of slavery for so long. They must be punished. Those are the two different arguments you've got coming out of Washington, D.C. And even though Lincoln died, the argument continued. Because when Lincoln was assassinated, this guy became president. And I don't know if you remember, Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. Remember, he was from Tennessee? Lincoln had him as his new vice president in the 1864 election. Because remember, Johnson was the only congressman or senator from a Confederate state who stayed loyal to the United States government during the war. So Johnson's the new president. And the thing about Andrew Johnson was he grew up in poverty. He was never really rich. He was a tailor by profession before he got in politics. He made clothes. He never made a lot of money. And so Johnson hated rich Southern white slave owners and plantation owners. And in fact, one of the first things that Johnson said as president was that the South was guilty of treason. Treason is a crime, and a crime must be punished. So when Lincoln was shot, yeah, the country was in mourning, but the radical Republicans who wanted the South to be punished, they thought, oh my God, this guy's great. Sorry Lincoln's dead, but man, this guy might be even better. He wants to stick it to the South just like we do. Yeah, Andrew, woo! Except as Johnson started making his true beliefs known, it got real clear that this guy, while he might have hated rich Southern white plantation owners, if there's a group Johnson hated even more, it was black people. This is possibly the most racist president the United States has ever had. And so when it came time to punishing the South, well, there's a lot of things the radicals wanted, like, the right to vote for black people that Johnson didn't get on board with. He's racist as heck. And the thing is, I think it's worth mentioning this. When Lincoln was assassinated, it was April of 1865. Congress was not scheduled to come back into session until December. 8 whole months where Andrew Johnson could do whatever the heck he wanted as president as far as bringing the South back into the Union. And I'll give you a sample of some of the stuff he's going to do until the Congress comes back and they're like, oh, we can't let this happen. You're going to have a battle between Congress and the president over Reconstruction. It's a mess. You guys can pick sides. But before Congress came back, Johnson launched what he called an amnesty program for the South. I don't know if you've ever heard the word amnesty. It's like if someone's accused of a crime, if you give them amnesty, you pardon them. Basically, you forgive them for any crime. Johnson was going to have a blanket amnesty program. Basically, if you swore loyalty to the U.S. government, even if you fought for the South, it's all good. You're forgiven. No sweat. No punishment at all. All you had to do was, swear that you were, loyal to the U.S. government. Now, you couldn't all do this. If you were really rich or like a really high-ranking officer in the Confederate Army, Johnson wasn't going to just give you a pass. You had a little more power. He thought you maybe had to jump through some more hoops. But you could actually get a signed personal presidential pardon from Vice President Johnson if you approached him or if someone approached him on your behalf. So even if you were like a general in the Confederate Army, you could go visit President Johnson in D.C. in the White House and sit down with him. Frankly, your best bet with Andrew Johnson was to bring a bottle of whiskey with you because Johnson liked to drink. And he'd sign a pardon for you. I've even got, I'll show you this on camera. It's a copy, you can't read it. It's a copy of Robert E. Lee's amnesty oath that he signed after he got a pardon from President Johnson, if you can believe that. And so you get these people getting pardons, giving amnesty to Southerners. One thing he did was, well, he was calling the shots. He took old Southern politician friends of his and put them temporarily in charge of each former Confederate state. And while these guys were in charge of these temporary or provisional governments in the South, he wasn't going to make these Southern states go anywhere beyond just ending slavery. He said to the Southern states, well, I encourage you to give black men the right to vote, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So of course they're not gonna. And so the whole 8 months that the radical Republicans were stuck sitting at home and Congress wasn't in session, they watched as good old Southern cronies got to run these states. No one's giving black people any rights. All these former Confederate officers are getting pardons left and right. Johnson signed 13,000 presidential pardons in 1865, pardoning Confederate officers, slave owners throughout the South, all these plantation owners, rich Southerners. And I want you to think about this. I want you to imagine that you were a civilian in the North during the Civil War, okay? Fact of the matter is, there was a good chance that you lost someone in that war. Your husband, your father, your brother, your son, okay? Well, Johnson is calling the shots in these months after Lincoln's assassination, after the end of the war. A lot of people thought the South really wasn't going to have to suffer at all. Like, the South didn't even really lose the war. It's just like, we're going to go back to the way things were before. That didn't sit well with some people. Just as an example, when Congress came back to session in December, a lot of former congressmen and senators from before the Civil War had jumped ship and served in the Confederate Congress or in the Confederate military. And they tried to walk back into the U.S. Capitol building in Washington as though the war had never even happened. This guy in the picture is Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. We've seen him. He tried to take his old seat in the U.S. Congress like nothing had ever happened. And Northerners got in fights with Southern politicians in Washington saying, no, something's got to give. You've got Northerners who were, like I said, civilians who said, my God, the South is going to just get off scot-free. Some Northern white people, I'll be honest, pretty racist, weren't necessarily fans of giving black people rights. Got to mention that. So they didn't necessarily want to go as far as, black suffrage in the South. But they sure wanted to see some consequences for the South, and it didn't look like there would be any. Just to give you an example, this blows my mind. The state of Mississippi conveniently never got around to ratifying the 13th Amendment. That's the one that ended slavery. And I don't know if you know, you need 3/4 of the states to ratify a constitutional amendment for it to become the law. So even if there's a state or two that doesn't ratify an amendment, it can still become a law. Mississippi never ratified the 13th Amendment after the Civil War. In fact, if I was there with you, we'd play a fun guessing game where you would guess what year Mississippi finally got around to ratifying the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. And you'd say a year and then say, oh, earlier than that or later than that. And gradually, as we got closer to the right year, your mind would explode because the state of Mississippi finally ratified the 13th Amendment to end slavery in, get ready, 1995. Yeah. And this blew my mind. It turns out that when a state ratifies an amendment to the Constitution, they also have to send an official documented certification of that ratification vote to Washington, D.C., so it can be entered into the record. Well, guess what? In 1995, when Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment, they forgot to send their certified ratification vote to Washington, D.C., so you'll never guess when they finally remembered to do that. February 2013. Yeah. It was 2013 before the ratification of the 13th Amendment to end slavery in Mississippi was official. Now, that doesn't mean that African Americans were still slaves in Mississippi until 2013. But this is an example of how nobody was really holding the South's feet to the fire in the early days of Reconstruction. While Johnson was calling the shots, Southern states did everything they could to try to restore the exact same order to society that they had before the war. Kind of like Thomas Pinckney saying, well, I know you're not really my slaves, but I still want you to work the same land for me. They didn't want anything to change. Heck, in the South, Southern states started passing what they called black codes, a bunch of laws that differed from state to state, basically keeping black people in inferior positions as far as social and political power. I mean, just let me give you some samples, right? Most Southern states passed mandatory curfews for African Americans. You had to be off the streets by like 9 p.m. There were only certain jobs that you could have if you were black. Some states said the only thing you could do was work in agriculture, which is a fancy way of saying you got to stay on the same old plantations. Some Southern states enacted the first gun control laws in American history by banning black people from owning guns or alcohol because they didn't want black people to get drunk and shoot white people. And the worst one to me was a few Southern states actually passed black codes that made it mandatory that black people had to refer to any white person they saw, especially white men, as master. It didn't matter if the black man was 70 and the white man was 18. He had to be referred to as master, if you can wrap your mind around that. It's all about control. And that's what these Southern states were able to get away with while President Johnson was calling the shots. In fact, in the first year of Reconstruction after the Civil War, there were 0 documented episodes of angry black mobs attacking white people. But the opposite was too high to count, of white people attacking blacks. Just as one example, in Memphis, Tennessee, soon after the war, the mayor of the city, who was white, goes without saying for that time period, the mayor of the city got an angry white mob together and they stormed a United States Army fort on the outskirts of town that was stationed with African-American troops and attacked them, because they couldn't stomach the idea of black troops defending the area and the forts. This is the sort of violence you're going to see. And again, until Congress came back to session in December 1865 to try to restore some balance here, Johnson was letting this stuff happen. And when Congress came back, whoo, man, the battle was on, guys. We've seen this picture before. And I want to give you an illustration of really what the picture is talking about. When Congress came back in December of 1865, these radical Republicans said, oh, hell no, you're letting the South get off way too easy. They have to be punished. And one of the ways they wanted to do that was to guarantee equal rights for black people in the South. So Congress passed two bills right after they came back to session that I want to mention. The Civil Rights Bill is self-explanatory. It was going to guarantee equal rights. Every right that white people had, black people were supposed to have it. You couldn't, discriminate against people based on race and things like that. The Freedmen's Bureau is a little more complex, and that's actually what this picture is supposed to represent. What Congress set up was the Freedmen's Bureau would have offices throughout the former Confederacy, and there would be Freedmen's Bureau offices. They'd be stationed with Union soldiers, and if you were black and you felt threatened or you felt like you were being discriminated against in hiring, or you were the victim of racial violence or anything like that, you go to the Freedmen's Bureau, and the United States Army and the Freedmen's Bureau were supposed to go to bat for you. That's why this picture has a soldier defending these black people. Well, these both passed out of the radical Republican-controlled Congress. But guess what happened when they landed on President Johnson's desk? You don't need to think too hard. Oh, he vetoed the heck out of both of these. And I want to explain the argument here. I think it's worth bringing up, okay? If you ask one of the radical Republicans why they felt like they had to give these people rights, their arguments would have been, pretty simple, but it would have had a lot of factors behind it. They're human beings, so they deserve equality. They've suffered under slavery for generations. It's the least we could do is to give them equal rights. Another popular argument was, we know this will make the white people in the South suffer if we give black people rights, so we're going to do that to punish the South for treason. Those are a lot of the common arguments you heard from the radical Republicans. So then if you were to sit down with President Andrew Johnson and interview him and say, well, why'd you veto these bills? Here's his answer. These are an inferior race of people. They're not ready for equality. They're not educated. They're not intelligent. They don't deserve equal rights. Until they earn these rights by proving to white people that they can handle them, they will not give any. And in fact, Johnson said, if we just go ahead and give them these rights right now, then they're just going to get lazy and expect handouts from the government. Johnson's argument was basically that black people had to prove something to white people, that white people got to decide when black people were ready for equality. And the fact is, in 1865 and 1866, most white people didn't want to give black people these rights. They did not think black people could handle equality. They still thought of black people as children. It was an old relic of the slavery era. And that attitude didn't go away anytime soon, folks. You get to the 20th century, you still see a lot of white people thinking that way about blacks. So this is your ultimate argument. They deserve it. It's a good way to punish the South, or no, they're inferior and they can't handle equality, right? That's one of the most common arguments. And I'll tell you what, the battle was on. When Johnson vetoed these bills, it didn't matter. Congress had the votes. They overrode both of these vetoes. And now it's pretty clear that for the rest of Johnson's presidency, as powerful as the radical Republicans were in the U.S. Congress, he was just the guy who lived in the White House. Congress could override any veto of his, all they wanted. And in fact, Congress took a look at, the radical Republicans in Congress took a look at the 13th Amendment, which had just abolished slavery. It didn't say anything about rights. And Congress said, we need to add to that. We need to strengthen that. I want to show you this, right? Now, this is part of the Constitution today. Oh, gosh, the 14th Amendment is still brought up anytime there are debates about equality, gay marriage, issues like that. Harkens back to the 14th Amendment. Radical Republicans proposed this amendment to the Constitution right after the Civil War. And it's fancy language, but it basically says, hey, if you're born here, you're a citizen. And citizens deserve rights. Now, I should mention there's a section later on in fancy legal language that also says, well, except Indians, they don't count, because it's the 1800s in America. But that's another story. But basically, this is Congress's way of saying, look, if you're born here, it doesn't matter if you're white or black, you deserve the rights of citizenship. And oh, man, people fought about this like crazy. In fact, before this could even be put up for ratification, this was 1866 by this point. And I don't know how much you guys follow politics, but we choose a new president every 4 years. The even year election between presidential elections is called a midterm election. There's a lot of seats in Congress and governor seats that are up for grabs at the midterm election. 1866 was a midterm election year. A lot of seats up for grabs in Congress. Everybody pretty much knew if the radical Republicans won a lot of seats in Congress in 1866, this 14th Amendment was going to be pushed through, and you'd see, by force if necessary, black rights being given to people in the South. And so Andrew Johnson wanted to stop this no matter what. It's not inaccurate to say Johnson got drunk, but okay, so here's what he did. Johnson was known to knock back a drink or seven. Heck, if you go back to Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration, Andrew Johnson was given the vice presidential speech at that inauguration. He was so drunk at Lincoln's second inaugural, they had to cut his speech short. So now Johnson decided he was going to go on a speaking tour of the country in 1866. He called it the Swing Around the Circle Tour. It might as well have been called the Take a Drunken Swing at Your Heckler's Tour. His whole message was he wanted to prove that these radical Republicans in Congress were steering the country in the wrong direction, that this was a nation of white men and built for white men. And in fact, in some of these speeches, even in northern cities like Detroit and Chicago and New York, Johnson started taunting his opponents in the crowd who believed in, black rights, or at least punishing the South. And in a few of his speeches, even in northern cities, Andrew Johnson, who we're pretty sure was not sober during these speeches, started saying, even in northern cities, it seems to me in 1866 that the South is where you'll find the true loyal Americans at this point, because they know what this country's all about. They know who this country was built for. And you Northerners who start talking about black rights and punishing treason, you're perverting this nation. He got heckled. He had stuff thrown at him. There's some stories that may or may not be true where people were throwing things at him and he was like catching them on stage and throwing them back into the crowd. That's presidential. And so when it came time for the midterm elections, Johnson supporters got just trounced. Radical Republicans got so much power in Congress after these elections. Like I said, Andrew Johnson might as well have just stepped down, to be honest with you. Now, these radical Republicans are going to do some things that, I'll be honest, goes more than a little bit beyond the Constitution too. But the bottom line is your battle at this point is what's going to happen in the South. What's going to happen with these free people? What kind of rights are they going to get and why? That's the real question. Also, how? Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of a term called martial law before. Martial, in this case, spelled M-A-R-T-I-A-L, not the other one. When the radical Republicans trounced Johnson's supporters in those elections in 1866, they knew they were running the country. Republicans in Congress ran this nation by 1867. There was nothing President Johnson could do to stop them. And so they said, we are going to force these Southern traitors, their words, not mine, to follow what we think they need to follow, to be punished and to accept. And it's a new world, and we get to decide what kind of world it's going to be. They put the former Confederacy under martial law, meaning they put military officers in charge of these southern states. They call it the Military Reconstruction Act. And I don't care if you memorize what former Confederate states are part of what district or who was in charge of them. But guys, check this map out. Tennessee was separate because Tennessee was pretty much controlled by the Union early in the war, and they came back in pretty easily. But the rest of the former Confederacy was carved into 5 military districts. And after this law was passed, these districts saw Union troops marching through their major cities again. It's a military occupation of the former Confederacy. People who thought the war was over were shocked to see these soldiers back in their states. They weren't there to attack. They weren't there to fight battles. They were there to force these southern states to accept things like black suffrage, like the right to vote for black people. And you want to look, black men to be specific, look at the map for a second. And I don't know how familiar you'll be with some of the names of the generals who were put in charge of these districts, but maybe a couple of them will ring a bell for you. Check out Texas and Louisiana. Remember Phil Sheridan, that hard-nosed cavalry commander? Remember when at Missionary Ridge at the Battle of Chattanooga, when the Confederates took a pot shot at him and he just charged up that hill anyway? I mean, you got some tough guys in charge of these districts. The guy in charge of the Carolinas, remember Dan Sickles? Lost his leg at Gettysburg, put his leg on display at a museum and visited it every year. And these are some tough guys in charge of these states. And now the South has to accept military rule. They have to accept black suffrage. Now, I don't know if you know, as you're watching this, but what's the president's job title when it comes to the military? It's commander-in-chief, isn't it? Well, this went threw over a veto from President Johnson too. Congress just decided this is how it's going to be. Congress was effectively commanding the army here. They're going against the Constitution. Johnson is supposed to be commanding the army, but Congress is taking the lead here. They're running the country as far as they're concerned. And then, just to go extra hardcore, the radical Republicans in Congress said, you know, we got a problem, and it's President Johnson. He's getting in our way. Really, if we could just get him out of the White House and put somebody more friendly to us in there, things would be so much easier than sticking it to the South, man. I don't know if you've heard of impeachment, the process by which, you know, an American president is put on trial for crimes against the country. Now, if a president gets impeached, it doesn't mean they're removed from office. It just means that there's enough evidence to put them on trial, okay? Well, there's been impeachment proceedings in this country before. Does the name Bill Clinton ring a bell, right? Well, Clinton wasn't removed from office either. He was impeached, but that just meant that he would be brought up on charges or put on trial for charges. And when the trial came, Bill Clinton he got off scot-free. He wasn't removed from office at all. So impeachment is something different. But to impeach a president, to bring them to a trial, you have to have some charges that you want to throw against them. And the radical Republicans basically realized Johnson hadn't broken any laws. So they, kind of shady, the radical Republicans in Congress made up a couple of laws that they figured Johnson would break. And then they could say, oh, he broke the law, let's impeach him. Woo! The laws are sketchy. They're frankly not constitutional, but they passed both of these laws over Johnson's vetoes. And I'll just mention them just so you know a little bit about what they're about. This Command of the Army Act. Remember, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. This Command of the Army Act said the president couldn't do anything with the army without Congress's approval. That's against the Constitution, but they passed it anyway. And then this Tenure of Office Act, a little complex. I'll try to make it easy for you. If the president wants so-and-so to be Secretary of Defense or wants to appoint someone to the U.S. Supreme Court, that person doesn't just get the job. Congress has to interview and approve that appointment. So this Tenure of Office Act said any government position that had to have Congress's approval for that person to be hired for the job cannot be fired without Congress's approval. Now that second half is not constitutional. It's not the law today, but that's something they were adding to the laws. And both of these tied together were because everybody in Washington pretty much knew that Andrew Johnson wanted to fire his Secretary of War. You remember Edwin Stanton? He'd been Secretary of War under President Lincoln. He was the guy who kind of took control of Washington after Lincoln's assassination. He was still Secretary of War under Johnson. And Stanton was a big fan of that Military Reconstruction Act. Remember, I said this would matter, that Stanton believed Lincoln's assassination had been a big Confederate conspiracy, right? So Stanton was in this frame of mind to punish the South, and he was on board with what these radical Republicans in Congress were up to. So word on the street was that Johnson wanted to fire Stanton. Well, when the Congress created these two laws, if Johnson fires Stanton, he's technically going against both laws. He's firing the person who oversees the military, and he's firing someone that, according to the Tenure of Office Act, can't be fired without congressional approval anymore. Johnson didn't care. You know Andrew Johnson enough to know that he doesn't care about these two made-up laws. He fired Stanton immediately. He actually tried to get Ulysses S. Grant to take over as Secretary of War, and Grant's like, yeah, no, I'm not even touching that. So Johnson got some other guy whose name doesn't matter. The bottom line is, as soon as he fired Stanton, Congress can say, aha, Johnson broke the law, let's impeach him, woo! They made the laws up, it didn't matter. They whipped up 12 charges of impeachment against Johnson. Most of them are just totally ridiculous. One of the actual charges they brought up against Johnson to impeach him said something about he is guilty of scandalous harangues against Congress, which is a fancy way of saying he's saying mean stuff about us, which apparently means he should be put on trial and removed from office. So whatever. So Johnson got impeached. That means that Congress decided there was enough evidence to put the president on trial for these charges, these alleged crimes. Impeachment just means it moves to a trial. And after Johnson was impeached and he was put on trial, the two people who prosecuted the president in the trial were people we've seen before. Remember Thaddeus Stevens from earlier in this video, a prime example of one of those hardcore radical Republicans who wants to punish the South and stick it to them and push black suffrage down the South's throat. And the other person putting the president on trial was good old Benjamin Butler. You remember him? The guy who was so unpopular in New Orleans for what he said about Southern women that they put his face on chamber pots? Yeah, these two guys were putting the president on trial in 1867. And if one more member of Congress had voted against the president, he would have been removed from office immediately. It was one vote shy. And the fact is, guys, this is 1867 now. The Civil War had been over for 2 years. A lot of these radical Republicans were hearing from the folks back home and said, well, yeah, we don't like Johnson. We think the South should suffer a little bit, but you're doing too much. Like, you're going too hardcore. You're pushing it through too fast. And they were hearing from their voters back home that removing the president was going too far. And so some of them voted not to kick Johnson out of office, because even by 1867, some Americans were saying, hey, let's move on. You know, let's move on. Let's forget about it. Of course, to be honest, the people who could afford to say that were white Americans whose rights and whose lives, in some cases, were not being threatened by the situation in the South. And another thing worth mentioning, guys, something we'll talk about next time, all this talk about black suffrage has focused on the South. You'll notice I never said anything about the radical Republicans making Michigan or Vermont accept black suffrage. It's because they weren't doing that. And it leads to an argument about what the real goal of the radical Republicans was. Was it racial equality, or was it just to punish the South? I mean, these are things worthy of more discussion. And as I said, I want you to think about whose side you're on here. If I made you pick a side between the radical Republicans and President Andrew Johnson, again, I think that's worthy of more conversation that you should be having. So these are things that we're going to see more down the road, because the bottom line is, I said we were going to spend 2 video clips looking at Reconstruction. Reconstruction, according to most historians, lasts about 12 years, which would take it to 1877. We've talked about 2 of those years in this video. And if Reconstruction is about rebuilding the country and literally reconstructing the South after the devastation of the war, maybe you noticed this whole conversation has talked about stuff going on in Washington, D.C. It's been a bunch of politicians arguing. So we got to see what's going on in the South, too. We'll do all that next time. We'll look at some of the chaos in the South and Reconstruction. It's complex and it's interesting as heck. And I'll see you then.